In police crime museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these black museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story.
At the very heart of forensic science is the theory that a criminal will take away something from the crime scene and leave a trace behind, however small. This proved to be the case in a horrifying series of crimes in 1984, when a masked intruder terrorised central England with his brutal rapes and burglaries. But tiny specks of paint left on foliage near the scene of one of his crimes and picked up by eagle-eyed officers would eventually lead to the capture of the man they dubbed the Fox.
The summer of 1984 was muggy and warm, but people who lived in what soon became known as the Triangle of Fear, which took in the Bedfordshire towns of Cheddington, Leighton Buzzard and Edlesborough, slept with their windows closed. For a series of rapes and burglaries, each one more violent than the last, had the area in a panic.
There's a climate of fear. It built up steadily over the months as his offences grew in seriousness and frequency. It shut down the social events in the area. We were working all the hours that God gave, obviously, which meant that my wife was on her own with a small child at the time. She never did tell me, but she was terrified.
Between March and December of 1984, this man was to commit 79 crimes. To begin with, these were burglaries, but in April, he carried out his first sexual assault. It took place in the village of Linslade, Bedfordshire. His victim was a 74-year-old widow who was disturbed by an intruder standing over her. Without speaking, he assaulted her.
I've no doubt he broke in there to commit a crime of burglary, just to steal. But he saw her in bed, and for some reason he decided to sexually assault her. I think he found that he had some power over people, and from that moment onwards he changed.
A crime scene officer took a cast of the marks made on a wooden window frame where the intruder had forced it open with a heavy screwdriver.
There were instrument marks associated with the scenes where the man had jemmied his way in through patio doors, and where a tool like a screwdriver or a case opener, will leave an indentation. Tools like that acquire random damage, and that can itself provide very valuable evidence when you come to compare a suspect tool with a mark. Now, one of the tools which he'd used was a screwdriver, a fairly cheap cast screwdriver, which had a rounded corner.
Just a month after this attack, another serious crime took place. A 35-year-old man returned to his home in Cheddington at 11 o'clock at night. Waiting for him was a masked man, and in his hands was the homeowner's own shotgun. Stop. Forward.
With the gun aimed at him, the terrified man was forced to tie himself up, and he was then blindfolded. He was subjected to a sexual assault. Then the intruder made off, taking the shotgun with him. A spate of burglaries in the area followed, and they shared some curious features.
He would take out photographs relating to females and young people and arrange those in a pattern and lay them out. So it just wasn't a matter of just looking at photographs, he was actually physically handling them and laying them in some form of pattern.
At some homes where burglaries had occurred, articles such as clothing and belts would also be laid out, as if ready to tie a victim up. Some weeks later, a couple from the village of Heath and Reach returned home in the early hours of the morning to find an intruder had been in their house.
And he'd removed the lamp bulb in the hallway so that when the occupiers returned home, they would go in darkness. He'd also constructed a hide where he'd taken 2 armchairs and covered a blanket over the top. Inside that, he'd put the television and video recorder, and he'd obviously done it so that nobody could see the television outside of the premises. He'd also made himself a pot of tea.
But before police had a chance to assess the situation, the alarm was raised just across the fields near Leighton. A man had been shot by an intruder. This man described how he had been asleep with his wife when he had woken up to see a figure outlined in the glow of the nightlight he left on for his small children. The intruder was holding the gun. He shouted at him, but as he did so, the gun went off. With his hand badly wounded, he chased the masked man, who managed to escape. He later lost a finger. But detectives found that the mysterious man had left behind an anorak. In the pocket was a packet of peanuts, both items stolen in the earlier housebreaking. A month later, the man, now called the Fox by the media, attacked again. 2 couples were subjected to assaults by an armed masked man, and in the second attack, which took place at a house in Linslade. The wife was raped.
It seemed as if the attacker would never be stopped. Just 2 days after the rape in Linslade, he struck again. This time, he chose the village of Edlesborough. Here, his prey was not a married couple, but 3 teenagers.
An 18-year-old girl, her brother and her boyfriend was subjected to a night of terror. The fox tied up the girl, raped her twice, then forced the boys to have simulated sex with her before assaulting them. The victims recalled that the man had at one point stood on the base of a standard lamp.
This standard lamp base was slightly dusty. When we examined it using a new technique in those days called DLK, we found a footwear mark that matched the other marks from the other previous burglaries.
The crime took on the status of a major investigation after the incident in Edlesborough, when 3 forces became involved and I was appointed the officer in overall command. On this occasion, we were fortunate to have Graham Craddock from the Forensic Science Laboratory attached to us full-time.
One of the more curious pieces of evidence to be revealed to Graham Craddock's team was the presence of rabbit hairs.
Now, they tended to crop up in the knots, in the ligatures with which the people had been tied. So the implication was that he had a pair of fur-lined gloves. And we did look at the question of whether they'd come from a live rabbit, and he bred rabbits maybe, but they were in fact, cured from skins, and so he wore gloves.
The next attack came a month later in Rotherham, in the north of England, far outside the triangle of towns that up until now had been his patch. It was characterised by the same sexually violent pattern, but this time, however, the fox's own attempts at evading forensic detection actually gave the police their first solid clues.
Significantly, because of the publicity of the forensic work that we were doing, he cut out a sheet, he washed the lady. Clearly, what he was trying to do was to protect himself and cover up any forensic evidence that he might leave at the scene.
As the police were to find out, the fox hadn't been as cunning as he thought. In the daylight, it soon became apparent that he had left not one, but many clues behind him.
Detectives could make out footprints in a trail away from the house. The house was situated not far from the junction of the M1 and the M18 in South Yorkshire, and the trail led them in the direction of some trees just off the motorway.
We recovered a pair of gauntlets, which had similar cut rabbit hairs in. We also recovered the weapon and the plastic bag in which it was stored, and from that we obtained fingerprint evidence. We'd finally established what type of hood and mask it was, and they were being made from the legs of trousers and being actually cut at the scene, prepared there for the offence. We also recovered the hairbrush from the victim's bedroom and a piece of the sheet which the offender had cut out.
We staged, with the help of the South Yorkshire Bus Company, an accident on the M18 that caused a great deal of confusion and trouble to other motorists, but it closed the northern side of the M18 so that a full forensic search could be carried out without alerting the offender.
They discovered more footprints and, importantly, tyre tracks.
They did a very meticulous search in the area and established that what appeared to be a vehicle had parked between some small trees. They actually physically tried another vehicle in that position to get measurements of the vehicle. Also, during their search, they found a very, very small particle of what appeared to be vehicle paint trapped on one of the small little trees.
The paint was at a height of 3 feet 9 inches, and the forensic officers deduced that it had got there when a car, most probably a hatchback, had reversed into the tree. The sapling, with its minute and incriminating fleck of paint, was carefully collected.
This was returned to the laboratory, where it was analysed and found to be Harvest Gold coloured vehicle paint, which was primarily used on Austin Allegro motor vehicles.
The case had caught the imagination of the public, and a newspaper put up a £50,000 reward for information that would help catch the fox.
I can in fact remember, after the crime at Rotherham, speaking to our daily briefing at Dunstable Police Station when we'd got something like 200 officers there, and I remember holding up the shotgun and just saying, look, we're very close now. We've actually got something that he's left behind. We've got some really good evidence that's pointing us to who this man is. We're going to find him very shortly. And I could feel the buzz in the room.
The net was closing in on the fox, but could they catch him before he struck again? With the help of forensic science, the police in the Fox case were getting ever closer to their suspect. Through the amazing discovery of a tiny sliver of paint, they even knew the colour and make of his car. They mobilised the biggest manhunt since the Yorkshire Ripper in an attempt to ensnare Britain's most wanted man.
In the Buckinghamshire-Bedfordshire Triangle of Fear, Up to 300 officers a night, including armed patrols, hid out, hoping to catch the fox. Police use military night sights, which amplify the available light, giving a picture even in the pitch darkness. Night and day, helicopters were used to survey the woods and farmland.
Clearly, as the crimes progressed, the amount of violence and the threat of violence increased. One of the early stages, of course, there was a shooting, so it showed that the fox was quite capable of using violence.
People stepped up the security in their homes, and there were record applications for shotgun licences.
The police were determined to learn from past mistakes. The Yorkshire Ripper case had taken 5 million police hours, and they interviewed the Ripper 9 times before they caught him.
In the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, there was such a volume of information going into the incident room that they were absolutely overwhelmed, and the amount of indexing cards that they used meant that at one stage they had to reinforce a floor on a first-floor room because of the sheer weight of these indexing cards, and so a decision was made in the early stages to install the computer.
Today, computers are commonplace. At that time, they were just coming into use in the police service for incident rooms.
Major Incident Computer Application, or Metal Mickey as the computer was nicknamed, was linked to the police forces that had joined the hunt.
At the height of news bulletins, we were getting calls at our incident room at the rate of 250 an hour, which takes a lot of managing. The public alone suggested over 3,000 people as possible suspects, and it might be the very simplest of messages that could lead to the identity of the offender.
Because of the Fox's northern connection, Brian Prickett had his team concentrate on 300 or so suspects, northerners with criminal records who had moved down south. 2 detectives, Richard Hanks and Nigel Tompkins, were part of Brian Prickett's team. They were gradually working their way through long lists of suspects, an operation known as TIE, T-I-E, Trace, Interview, Eliminate.
Each team had a pack which detailed things like paint slides, shoe lifts that have been taken from the scenes, point of entry marks that have been taken from screwdrivers.
The 2 of them travelled down to Kentish Town in North London to locate the next name on their list.
It was a very routine inquiry. Very routine inquiry. There wasn't very much evidence to say that this was the person responsible for these offences.
And our intention on that day was to go down and hopefully locate him and interview him. The ultimate aim being to eliminate yet another name from the inquiry.
As we walked around the corner, saw this man working on the car. That's the first piece of excitement, really. He did match the description, even down to wearing a striped shirt.
He just seemed like an ordinary guy. I mean, he was quite calm. He didn't appear too nervous outwardly.
He was working on nearby to a car, a gold Allegro, that was the right colour and the right make. Yeah. First of all, we had to connect him to the Allegro. It wasn't registered to him, so we had to establish that he was the owner of it by saying, "Is this your car?" And he said yes.
DC Hank started to speak to him while I had a look round at his vehicles, and that the glass slide matched exactly the colour of the car. There were some very slight scrape marks at the right height for where those paint scrapings were taken.
And then when you speak to the man, he's got a northern accent. His accent had been described as several, but one of them was a northern accent. Another further piece of excitement.
We started to look underneath the Allegro that we'd got, and there was debris wedged under the car, and the scientists again had told us that if we found the vehicle, there would be debris where it had been backed off the motorway.
I think both of us individually were getting more and more excited as we did our individual roles.
We found screwdrivers in the boot of the car that matched, at first glance, the points of entry marks that had been provided by the forensic scientists. We found in the boot some material from some trousers that it was suspected had been used to cut down and form a hood.
We knew from the victims of the crime that this man wore a watch on his right wrist with a stainless steel strap. I saw the watch on his dashboard and I asked him to put it on just to make sure. I said to him that it didn't get stolen. He put it on his right wrist.
And I knew at that point that this was the fox.
I looked at Nigel looked at me, and that was it. But we just said, this has got to be the man. And the next step was, you're under arrest, etc., etc., and handcuffs on.
Malcolm Fairley was the 580th suspect to have been interviewed.
He looked at me when I walked in the interview room and he said, "I've seen you on television many times and I never ever thought I'd see you alive." And I said to him, "I was convinced I'd meet you."
The news broke and I had a call from Bedfordshire Police Headquarters to say a man had been arrested. You felt as if you wanted to open the windows and shout the news out. I can remember the hair standing up on the back of my neck at the time. It was an amazing feeling.
Normally the role of the Forensic Science Service is to try to demonstrate whether the police have charged the right person or not. Sometimes it's possible to exclude the person entirely. Now, in this case, the involvement of the service was in the investigation of the crime, and by the time that this man was caught, we knew everything about him apart from his name. Had it not been for the car, the police wouldn't have caught him that early. He might have gone on to commit further crimes. So the role of the Forensic Science Service was not just unusual at that stage, but really was crucial.
When faced with the massive evidence, Fairley soon confessed to being the fox. He was a 32-year-old labourer, born the youngest of 10 children in the mining village of Silksworth, now a suburb of Sunderland. As a boy, he was involved in petty crime, and from then on was constantly in and out of prison.
At the time of his arrest, Fairley was living in London with his children and second wife. He had left the North East in the autumn of 1983 and moved south to Aylesbury. His new surroundings provided rich pickings for such an expert burglar. When asked why he carried out these terrible attacks, he said he didn't know, but it was like another person was doing them. And all the while, he carried on with his family life. How Fairley targeted his victims also came to light.
One of his hobbies was making and flying model aircraft. And very close to Dunstable is the Ivanhoe Beacon, which is a high beauty spot with beautiful views all over the flatlands of Bedfordshire and into Buckinghamshire. And he used to go with his model aircraft, sitting on the top of Ivanhoe Beacon, picking out the villages where he would go and commit either a crime of burglary or where he would go and seek out someone in a house to commit a rape. It was interesting that the nearest he ever parked his car to any of the scenes was over 2 miles away. He also cut across fields, and if he saw a car that he believed was a police car, he would simply lie down. The chances of finding him were fairly remote. After Malcolm Fairley's arrest, he was a model prisoner, in fact was very, very cooperative, and we took him to the various scenes where he'd committed the crime, and he would talk us through why he decided to commit that crime, how he picked out the location, and what he did.
When Fairley's trial opened at St Albans Crown Court, hundreds of people waited outside to try to catch a glimpse of the fox.
The one thing that we were never able to establish from him was a motive. Why did he do it? He used to have a collection of pornographic videos, and the judge at the trial where he pleaded guilty formed the view that that had played a significant part in his background. But I'm not 100% convinced that that was the reason. I believe that in the early stages he was a burglar. He felt insignificant, and suddenly he got power. And in fact, he said, when I pointed the gun at someone, I was king.
Fairley admitted raping 3 women, indecent assault on a man and another on the 74-year-old woman, 5 burglaries and 3 aggravated burglaries with intent to rape while carrying a firearm. He asked for 68 other crimes, mostly burglaries, to be considered. Fairley's defence counsel painted a picture of a very inadequate man who did not fully understand the wickedness of his actions.
The court case lasted just one morning. In passing sentence, the judge stated, "They are crimes that leave your victims with utter terror and with lifelong burdens of frightened memories. You desecrated and defiled men and women, young and old." In February 1985, Malcolm Fairley received 6 life sentences.
The strength of the forensic evidence in this case was enough to make Fairley admit the offences. But if he hadn't have admitted them, the evidence that we had was so conclusive that it would have led to his conviction anyway.
The tale of the fox shows the importance of technology and science in tracking down determined criminals. Offenders can be convicted on the evidence that would have gone undetected in the early days of the crime museum. In this case, without the ability to analyse tiny paint chippings or process such a huge amount of information, the hunt for the fox would have taken a lot longer and put a lot more innocent people at risk.